Hi, I'm Samantha Hogan, and I'm with the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting and Pine Tree Watch. We're here at Rising Tide Brewery in Portland with Alan Sipress from the Washington Post. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and Alan is the Middle East editor for the Washington Post, and what I really want to know is just walk me through your day. What is it like to cover the Middle East at the Washington Post?
Well, I have a team of 8 correspondents, and they're in 5 different bureaus in the Middle East.
Okay.
And they're all up 7 hours before I am. So by the time I'm up in the morning at 5:30 or 6, they're already working on whatever day news there is. Okay. Their work is a combination of daily news, but also enterprise stories, some pretty ambitious enterprise stories that we try to do. So I'll check in with them while I'm drinking my first cup of coffee. And then by the time I get into the newsroom about 8:30 in the morning, they're well on their way. They may have even filed the first version of a story, but we have overnight editors in Dubai and in Hong Kong who can pick up the stories, and then I'll take it over once I get in. So the first half of the day is often focused on whatever the breaking news might be. There might have been a terrorist attack, there might be a political development. By the time their day is starting to wind down, I'm really focused on the more ambitious enterprise pieces we're doing, trying to finish the edits on those and getting back to them so we can get those stories together as well. So for them it's a juggling act, and for me it's a juggling act, trying to stay in the immediate news cycle, but also give our readers something that's higher value.
Yeah, and is it different covering the news of the Middle East than it is covering the news of the U.S.? Is there anything that you have to look at differently, or how do you guys approach telling those stories?
There are a number of differences, and the time difference is only the most minor of the differences. Our readers are much more intimately familiar with the stories in the United States. They have the background. We don't have to walk them through basic steps. And they also naturally tend to care much more about what's happening with politics or policy here in the United States because it affects their lives directly. So we have to realize that a lot of our readers are not as passionately interested in what's going on in Turkey or Iraq or Iran or Israel as I am, for instance, or my reporters are. Our challenge is to figure out how to tell stories from places that can seem very obscure and opaque, and where the violence can just seem, tiresome month after month, year after year. How to come up with new ways to tell stories that will make them care and draw them in. And that's something that is different than how you would handle domestic coverage. We always want to make the readers care, but we have to be more creative when we're writing and editing about events overseas.
You took over as the editor, the Middle East editor, in January of 2018, and you've been with the Post for almost 2 decades now.
Right.
But I think a story started to unfold in 2018 that you guys could have never seen happening, and that was Jamal Khashoggi's story. And he joined the Washington Post as a columnist pretty in the fall, and then within a month, this whole slew of events started to take place. So walk me through, what was your relationship with Jamal Khashoggi, and then how did you go about being the editor covering the story of his murder?
Well, Jamal came to the Washington Post as a columnist. He wasn't on staff, but he was a contributing columnist for us, and he worked very closely with the folks in the editorial department. He had a couple editors up there who he grew very close with. Mm-hmm. My relationship with him wasn't all that close for the time that he was writing, because we very much separate the opinion section of the paper from the news section of the paper. But on October 2nd of last year, we started hearing that he had gone into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul hours before, and he had not emerged. And we were hearing in real time what was happening, because his fiancée was waiting for him outside, and she was in touch with people who were directly in touch with us. So while she's still standing outside the gates of the consulate, we're already wondering what's happened to Jamal. At first we thought maybe he'd been taken somewhere else. We never would have imagined that he had been killed, especially not inside a diplomatic consulate like that. In the days that followed, we tried to find out whatever we could. We have 2 full-time correspondents in Istanbul, mm-hmm. Karim Fahib, our bureau chief, and Aaron Cunningham, who were appointed at this full-time. And within a matter of days, we were the first organization to break the news that there was information that, in fact, he had been killed inside the consulate by a team that had been sent from Saudi Arabia specifically to carry this out. And then in the days and weeks and months that followed, we flooded the zone. We sent in maybe 10 different correspondents into Istanbul, other members of my Middle East team. We seconded someone from the European team. We sent out one of our best investigative reporters from Washington. Wow. And we just kept pounding and pounding. This was a huge story for us, and it was for a couple of reasons. I mean, it was a big story even if it had not been associated with the Washington Post. This was the murder of a well-known personality inside a diplomatic compound. It was also a big deal because he was a journalist who had been killed perhaps for doing his job. And our reporting had to be an insurance policy so that other governments or other people who try to carry out similar kinds of attacks would know that they would be held accountable. Yeah. Otherwise, my entire team would be in jeopardy working in that part of the world. So we knew we had to get to the truth best as we could. Otherwise, everyone would be in danger. And then finally, he was part of our family. And it felt very personal for us to try to push and push. And I think I kept a running count. I think by December of last year, we had published about 250 different stories about Khashoggi on the foreign pages, the national pages. We had stories in the feature section, stories in the local section. It was just everyone on board.
But do you know what I remember? So I was in Washington, D.C. around that time, and I was a regular reader of the Washington Post, but I remember on October 5th, just the emotional reaction that people had when the Washington Post decided to run the blank space where Jamal Khashoggi's editorial should have gone. And so we talked beforehand about how, and you've mentioned this time that, you know, editorial and news are really separated at the Washington Post. But were you involved in that conversation on October 5th about, you know, running that blank space? And what did you guys even know at that point?
I was not part of the conversation. I didn't know they were going to do it till I saw it in the paper. Wow. I mean, that's the way we operate. We operate on two tracks. The editorial side does their thing, and we do our thing, and that's to make sure that no one can question the objectivity and the fairness of what we do on the news side. It was very moving, of course, for all of us, but then we got back to work doing the journalism we needed to do.
Has what's happened with Jamal Khashoggi influenced how you work as an editor? I mean, do you think about news or the safety of the reporters that you're working with in the Middle East in a different light now that this has happened?
No, I don't. I think about the security and safety of my correspondents with an intensity that I haven't had to bring to editing in other sections of the paper, whether it was on the national staff or in the business staff. We send our folks into really dangerous places. We send them to war. We've been to northern Syria 4 times this year already. And we send them to Libya. We were reporting from the front lines. We send them into Yemen. We've been there several times. And we take enormous care to make sure that we know the situation they're going into. We give them the equipment so they can stay safe. We track them. They all have satellite trackers, and they also have other trackers on their phones so that I can in real time sit at my computer screen and see where they are and are they at the place they're supposed to be. We have a security consultant in London who's also looking at the same information I'm looking in. And we take this very, very seriously. And we pay significant amount of money to give them, to get them the insurance to make sure that they're protected when they go into these environments. So we know that these are dangerous situations, whether it's in a war or whether it's dealing with autocratic authoritarian governments that have shown what they think of a free press. What happened to Khashoggi has not changed our calculation, but it's underscored that we're right to pay the mind that we do.
And why is it important to keep telling these stories and keep sending people to these locations?
Well, for a number of reasons. These are very human stories. There are things going on in this world that not only do we think our readers ought to know about, but I think a segment of our readers want to know about. They care about the experience of people around the world, you know, their suffering and their aspirations, their hardships and their dreams. And so we want to give them those stories. But beyond that, the parts of the world we send people to are really fundamental for U.S. foreign policy. You know, the folks a couple blocks from us at the White House or a little farther away in the State Department, you know, are making policy that have huge implications, not only for the people out there, but for the United States. And so we were writing in the days and weeks ahead of the president's decision to pull troops out of northern Syria, what role those troops were playing, what would happen if they were pulled out, what that would mean for the local populations, and what that would mean for U.S. interests. And so we are providing inputs to some of the most important national security decisions that our government makes.
And I think one of those foreign policy locations that we have a lot of questions about right now is, what's really going on with Iran? You work with reporters that are covering this every single day. What can you tell us about what's going on right now?
So Iran is a difficult story for everyone to tell. We have specific challenges. Our correspondent in Iran, Jason Rezaian, was arrested by the Iranian authorities a number of years ago, and he was held for a year and a half. And we didn't know whether, we always hoped he'd be released, but it was always touch and go. And ever since Jason was released, the Post has made a decision that we do not go to Iran. We don't send reporters into Iran. We don't hire stringers or freelancers or fixers or photographers inside Iran. So Iran is perhaps the most important country right now in the part of the world that I'm responsible for, and we cover it from outside. And we cover it primarily with a very good reporter named Erin Cunningham, who's based in Istanbul. And we try to find creative ways to get at that story, talking to people on the inside, talking to people who've left and who are on the outside. And we try to penetrate that society. It is both opaque, but it's also one of the most dynamic societies in the Middle East. There is a liveliness to Iranian society and even political discourse that you don't see in much of the Arab world. And so that gives us an opportunity to, I think, to capture what's happening and get some understanding of what the forces are.
And then another country that you guys cover that also has interest in Iran is Israel, which is rapidly approaching a new snap general election where Benjamin Netanyahu is going to, essentially be up to decide whether or not he can get a coalition of a government together, which they couldn't do earlier this year. We're also waiting on the Israeli peace plan to come out of the Trump administration. There's a lot to unpack there. So I'll let you just run with what we're expecting to see even in the next couple of weeks.
Sure. So the Israelis go to election on Tuesday. It looks highly likely that they will end up exactly where they did in the spring, when they remained so deadlocked that they couldn't form a governing coalition, and they were forced for the first time in their history to go back to a do-over election. It's not clear how they're going to extricate themselves from the situation, because the Israelis are already aghast that they've had to go back once, and there's no appetite to go back a second time. So there's going to be a lot of wheeling and dealing to see how they can finally put together a governing coalition. For those folks who follow Israeli politics, I would say keep your eyes on one individual. His name is Avigdor Lieberman. He is the former defense minister under Netanyahu. He was the guy who essentially blocked the coalition from being formed last time, and he will be the kingmaker probably this time. He'll have enough seats in the parliament, the Knesset, to decide who gets to be the next prime minister. Beyond the election, the big question is, what happens with Netanyahu if in fact he's able to hold on to his office? He's already the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, having passed David Ben-Gurion this summer in terms of longevity. And Netanyahu is now facing criminal charges in 3 cases of corruption. And the prosecutor has promised to move ahead with the indictments pending a hearing. Netanyahu's survival depends on his ability to hold onto his office and then win legislation in the parliament that would grant him immunity. So he has a lot more riding on this than just whether he's the prime minister. His freedom could be riding on whether he can win this election or not. And everyone will be watching very closely to see if he is elected, whether he can get the immunity bill, and if he's not elected, how quickly the prosecution moves ahead.
Well, Alan, we've talked a lot about the Middle East, but I also want to ask you about the book that you wrote, which is The Fatal Strain, looking at avian flu. And I was thinking about this and how, when there's a novel virus like Ebola in 2014, we get wall-to-wall coverage of these events. But then the Democratic Republic of Congo has been dealing with an Ebola outbreak for more than a year now. And it's almost like we become a little bit jaded with these topics. Are we jaded with covering flu, and should we maybe be paying more attention to it?
I don't know that we're jaded in terms of our flu coverage. Flu remains one of the greatest public health threats that the world faces. An influenza virus just needs a couple mutations, a couple genetic tweaks, and it could be truly catastrophic for the human race. We saw what happened back in 1917. That was devastating for the world, and it only killed about 2% of the world's population. Only 2%. We could face something that's a lot worse. But people can only worry about so many things at any given time. They worry about making their mortgage payment, or they worry about what's going to happen in the next American election. Or, at the moment, we don't face an imminent flu threat. There are some very, very bright people out there who are monitoring this very, very closely. And I have no doubt they'll sound the alarm if there is more reason to worry. The other thing that's happened that's very significant since I wrote that book a number of years ago is there have been major advances in the development of a vaccine that could protect against a whole range of flu viruses, and that's the holy grail. Until now, you need an influenza vaccine that's targeted specifically to a particular strain, and influenza mutates so quickly that you need a different vaccine every year, and even then, it has limited effectiveness. If they could actually develop a vaccine that could target something that's essential about influenza and give us the kind of protection that we have against other viruses that don't mutate with the same rapidity, that would be a huge development for the world's public health.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much for having me.